So much, Gina. And thank you all for joining us today. My name is Amy Minix, and I'm the chair of the Scholarly Communication Committee, which is part of the Education and Behavior Science section of ACRL. Today, we're joined by Anita Walz and Julee Farley. Anita is the Assistant Director of Open Education and Scholarly Communication Librarian at Virginia Tech. And Julee Farley owns and manages Julee Farley Consulting. And today's session, we are going to host a watch and discuss event. So if you're not familiar with that, we are going to spend some time watching Anita and Julie's presentation, which is Boundary Spanners, Bridging Gaps Between Higher Education and PK12. This work was originally shared at the 2021 Open Education Conference and discusses their work to bridge the divide between research happening in academia that impacts primary and secondary education and the practical applications happening in schools that inform best practices. So we will spend about 20 minutes watching the presentation and spend the remainder of the time discussing how this practice can span beyond education into other disciplines within and outside of the education and behavior sciences. So as Gina mentioned, feel free to drop any questions you have for Julie and Anita in the chat. And without further ado, before we get started, Anita and Julie, would you like to add anything before we jump into the presentation?
No, just want to say we're glad you're here and we look forward to seeing what your questions are and having a conversation after this. Julie?
I'm excited to talk with everyone about this topic because it's something I'm really excited about. So I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you both. And just a couple of practical pieces of information. I'm going to drop a link to the committee's library guide. And here we have all of the resources that Julie and Anita will be talking about today, as well as some other kind of research and application articles related to EBSS. And at the end of today's session, I'll also share out a feedback survey. So please feel free to provide any feedback for our presenters today or any recommendations that you would like to see in terms of programming from the Scholarly Communication Committee within EBSS. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we will jump into the presentation.
Of where this presentation is going.
Sure, thank you, Anita. So in this presentation, we'll discuss the expectations, usefulness, and communication in sharing between higher education and pre-K-12. This will talk about misconceptions and implementation. We'll also introduce this concept of boundary spanners and boundary objects. And as a potential solution to these problems, we'll overview our project and what we did with that, how we got started and what we accomplished. And then we'll finally leave some time for questions, like Anita said. So to give you some context for this sharing between higher education and pre-K-12, there is a big history, a long history of sharing between higher education and pre-K-12, and some attempts of sharing have been more successful than others. Right now, how a lot of teachers share their resources is teacher to teacher, usually in the same grade level or within the same school, and often a lot of sharing within school districts, not a lot of sharing across districts. So higher education faculty, staff, and students often want to share their resources, and pre-K-12 is very receptive to this usually because they really want these expert materials authored by people that are outside of their classroom and are really doing this new cutting edge research. But there can be some significant implementation issues, and Anita will start talking about those implementation issues on our next slide.
Some of the implementation issues include a lack of communication, that we're not communicating effectively across our different contexts. In fact, the sharing has been predominantly one directional, flowing from higher education to pre-K-12. when in reality, it's far better for this type of work to be participative. Higher education faculty, staff, and students can create really great resources, but if they don't fit the context, they can't be personalized by teachers, and they don't consider the classroom environment in mind, they're not helpful and they won't get used. But there are some implementation related misconceptions on both sides. Julie's going to introduce these for us.
So some of these implementation issues, we'll talk about first the misconceptions by pre-K-12, and then we'll move on to the misconceptions by higher ed. The first one in pre-K-12 is that teachers may believe that faculty and staff and students in universities are required to do outreach, which is often not the case. And because they believe that faculty, staff, and students are required to do outreach, they may believe that they are skilled in doing outreach, which may not also be the case. Another thing to keep in mind is that teachers may be looking for something to use in their classroom within the next month, but in higher education, there is often a grant funding cycle where you apply, you wait to hear, and then you might get funding, you might not. So there can be dramatically different timelines. As far as misconceptions by higher ed, there may be a lack of knowledge about what pre-K-12 teachers need in their classroom. For example, often teachers have to teach to standards that are set by the state and prepare their students to take standardized tests at the end of the class. There could be time constraints in the classroom. Teachers may be required to cover a certain amount of material within a certain amount of time. So they may not have more than a day or more than 30 minutes to do a certain outreach activity. Also, teachers may be required to submit detailed lesson plans that may have specific requirements based on their district. Someone who's not in public education may not have the knowledge or skills to create the level of detail needed in the lesson plan. And teachers may be required or may prefer to do differentiation for their students, meaning that they may make slightly different tasks or skills set tasks for their students who have different skills. So what's really the important takeaway here is recognizing that pre-K-12 teachers are experts in teaching their grade, and they're experts at differentiating for their students. So while teachers may recognize that university faculty, staff, and students are experts in their field, university and higher ed may not have that same recognition of teachers. Or even if they do, they might feel that they cannot or they should not ask pre-K-12 teachers for guidance, that it might be too much of a burden. But with these participatory partnerships, it's really much more beneficial to ask the expert to help collaborate with you on your resources. And similarly to higher ed, there's not an obligation for most pre-K-12 teachers to bring outreach into their classroom.
Thank you, Julie. So regarding implementation issues in higher education, at least, there are a number of significant issues. First of all, guidance is needed in several different areas. Guidance is needed regarding including and sharing things that are not original to the author, such as student works, third-party graphics, other sorts of elements. Guidance is needed regarding formatting. What kind of format, what kind of file types are helpful if we assume that teachers want to customize the things that are shared with them? What kinds of formats can they easily edit? And then lastly, why accessibility or ADA compliance is important and how to achieve this. So how do we bridge this chasm? How do we bring together two different groups that have compatible goals, but different languages, different contexts, and assumptions about each other that are not quite accurate? How do we work together? How can work that benefits both groups be coordinated so that both may reach their goals and move forward in ways that are productive? How do we do this when the work is of great benefit to both groups, but is extra. It's not required, but it's really on top of everything else. And then how do we make the common ground apparent to others? Because there is common ground. Julie's going to talk with us about one possible solution.
So one possible solution to this is the boundary spanner. And a boundary spanner is a person who can link an organization or groups to share knowledge and resources. And one of the tools that boundary spanners often use are called boundary objects. Boundary objects are any object that is part of multiple groups and that can facilitate communication between these groups. Some examples of this could be something like a business plan. It could be a map. It could also be things like field notes to help share your information. So there's a wide array of what a boundary object can be. So who is a boundary spanner? We are. And it's likely that there are probably more boundary spanners in your organization than you might realize. So on this next slide, we'll talk about what the roles of a boundary spanner are and their goals. And this will help you to identify if you might be a boundary spanner or if you have a boundary spanner in your organization. So the biggest goal of a boundary spanner is to bring together diverse communities in a productive way. Boundary spanners can be formal or informal, meaning that this could be your job. You could be formally assigned to communicate between groups, or it could be informal. It could just be something that you've discovered you're good at and that you're doing without necessarily being paid or told by anyone to do that. But the big goal is to either link organizations that don't have overlapping people in them, or to span holes in networks. So you may have groups of people that are separate and one person can help bring these groups together. So we're really focusing on the idea here of mutually beneficial partnerships and that we don't need to be recreating the wheel at the same time. So it's much more efficient for us to team up and to share our resources. So in our next slides, Anita and I will talk about how we teamed up and shared our resources for our project.
Thank you, Julie. So the project started with a referral from Julie's supervisor regarding copyright and open licensing, which is an area in which I work. And I was happy to meet with them. And but something interesting happened.
So initially we thought that we would just talk with Anita maybe once or twice to get some information, and that after that we would be good to go. We would have everything figured out. But what we really found is that it was much better for us to meet routinely so that we could have this goal of creating documents that can scaffold what our creators are doing. So we're hoping that our documents that we've created can really help guide this process that we're going to talk to you about.
And we wanted to make the process more independent for potential contributors. So as we've alluded to before, we identified several areas in which the additional documentation was needed. And you'll see on this slide that this led us to create a review checklist for submitters. This clearly communicated to higher ed faculty, staff, and their students the best practices for designing shared content for pre-K12, focusing primarily on ownership, including student works, other third-party works. So looking at things like fair use, open licenses, public domain, using your own original work, and secondly, accessibility of created resources for students with disabilities. Julie.
We also created a form to obtain permission from a third party, including students, to release under an open license. So this will be used by the submitter for students and or third party works. We adapted a form so that submitters are giving permission to the center to publish and release the materials under an open license. And the last thing that we created were these process management checklists. These are really a review checklists to make sure that The submitter can ensure that they're submitting all the things that they should be, like their content, any of their third-party agreements, and that they're agreeing to let the center publish their work.
So
Jump in and say it's 4 o'clock.
thank you. Thanks, Tina. So we've since learned that Go Open Virginia, which is the platform through which the content will be shared, provides some guidance resources. These were added in July 2021 that meet some of these needs. We also feel it's valuable for Virginia Tech and for the center to have customized instruments because we're finding more projects within the institution that need this type of guidance. So we're going to talk about what we accomplished and why it matters.
So one of the most important goals that we've accomplished is that faculty can share more easily. Faculty, staff, and students can share more easily, which was really our original goal. We wanted these people to be able to get their resources out there in a widespread way that's going to work for teachers.
We now have documentation, or we have documents that can be used in projects where faculty are creating and sharing their original learning materials and incorporating students in the learning process to share their original learning materials. Significantly, with regard to my learning and learning in higher ed about the K-12 context, there's a lot to be learned about past problems and existing processes, the blind spots that higher ed may have toward pre-K-12. Knowing about the importance of a bidirectional flow of information in developing these tools has helped us to inform the collaborative ventures we hope for the better.
And for me, I learned a lot more about copyright and open licensing and accessibility, and how some of these things aren't necessarily as complicated and scary as they might initially seem. We
also found that we looked for these kinds of resources and we did not find them. So we think the framework may exist in pieces, but we're not finding that it exists anywhere else, or not that we easily found. So we're working on an open publication regarding this project to document some of our work. We have some additional findings and observations from our work in the form of messages for higher education and then messages for pre-K-12. So if we were to address a higher ed group that is interested in starting a project with pre-K-12 teachers, these are the messages that we would want to share. That pre-K-12 teachers are experts at teaching, that there is a lot of effort that goes into creating a generalizable lesson plan that is shareable. It's complex, it's not small, and it's not easily accomplished. Generally in projects like this, teachers who create these sorts of resources, they don't own them, and they are usually paid for their contributions.
So some questions that you can ask to help you create your partnership with K-12 could be things like, what standards are your students struggling with? So this could help you get an idea of where the teachers might need a real world example that could help their students better understand a concept. Or how much time do you have to spend on this specific task to make sure that the thing that you're designing will fit into their classroom constraints? Is there a specific terminology that should be included that you want students to be exposed to? With a lot of educational standards, teachers are told to cover very specific terms in their lessons, so including those in yours will really help validate that and reinforce what teachers are teaching. What would make it easy for you to actually use the material? Creating something is great, but if it's really difficult to use and it doesn't get used, then it's not as great. So being able to have something that's easily editable, for example, often helps teachers. And when do you plan to teach the material? How far in advance would you like to receive it? this is really being aware that when a teacher receives a lesson plan, they still have to review it and prepare for implementation in their classroom. So being aware of how much leeway they need to actually make that happen.
Julie's now going to talk a little bit about messages that would be appropriate for pre-K-12 people in these sorts of projects.
Right. So keeping in mind, as we discussed earlier, that project timelines in higher education can be much longer than they are in pre-K-12, and may also have a higher degree of uncertainty. So for example, if you're applying for a grant, this project may or may not be funded, which indicates more uncertainty than teachers might anticipate in their classroom. There's also, if you apply for this grant, you may not hear about a funding result for months. So keeping in mind that maybe you're even planning implementation for something in the next school year. And also knowing that without funding, higher education faculty, students, and staff may not actually have an obligation or actually an opportunity to conduct outreach. And that outreach generally isn't something that's rewarded by the tenure and promotion process.
So we have, oh, sorry, did I interrupt you?
No, that's fine. These are just our references, and you'll also be able to see a link to our presentation. Anything you wanted to add?
Yes, I'm putting the link to the presentation and the resources in the chat right now. And you're welcome to go there and see those particular forms and the documents that we talked about.
All right, so I think that's a good place to kind of pause and regroup. So I see we do have some questions in the chat. And to kind of mirror Anita's sharing of the resources, I'm going to go ahead and pop in that library guide that includes the links to both the presentation and the forms and checklists that you mentioned in your initial presentation. So let's start with this first question here. This one's from Deanna. Many of us need or want to do outreach as part of our jobs, but we may not really understand how best to accomplish it since we usually aren't trained to reach out. How can we do better at providing support for outreach and for becoming a boundary spanner? Presenters or participants, what has and has not worked for you?
Thanks, Deanna. I think that is a great question. And that I think doing outreach and providing support for outreach are two different things, I think. And when you are a boundary spanner, you are sometimes doing outreach, but you're often the one who is providing the support for the outreach. And I think that in this role, what really helps is being familiar with the needs of all of the different groups that you are interacting with, and not just their needs, but also their current priorities. So for example, with school systems, in one of the other comments down here that mentioned things like being overwhelmed with COVID, that is something to be aware of as well. And sorry, I got distracted by all of the chats coming in. So I think that when you are trying to become a boundary spanner, your goal is really thinking about how you can support others and how you can connect them. So for that will depend on the different groups that you're working with, I think. So they can be, if we're talking about university and K-12, which could be formal or informal, then yeah, I hope that in supporting these groups, one of the things that I would encourage you to do is bring everyone together if possible, or at least a few stakeholders, and get everyone to talk together and get everyone into a shared goal, shared priorities, and to create that relationship that could begin to move forward.
So I would add, and thank you, Julie, for that. Deanna, I don't know what your current role is, if you're a librarian, if you're an educator, if you're in some other capacity, if you're in a museum or a business. For the librarians in the group, what is I think relatable or transferable is the librarian liaison role, where we talk about getting out into the college or the university or the school and making those kinds of connections. So there is some literature in that field that it can help us to make that transition. And I think we have some of those skills already in terms of really listening to people, finding out what do they really need, instead of coming to them with the solution for a problem maybe that they don't have, or that isn't their highest priority to work on. There's a very large role for learning about your potential audience and understanding what their goals are and really becoming their advocate, rather than bringing your own content in whatever format you're bringing it, because it's not likely that you fully understand what they need unless you ask, and unless you develop that trust with them where they really will tell you, and unless you ask some of the right questions that maybe we don't know because we are in different contexts. So that's where the boundary spanner idea comes in, is that we don't really know the other context. We don't necessarily realize that we don't know it. And the process of getting to know it, finding out what to ask, how to ask it, and how to build that relationship is really critical to things actually being useful and valuable for the people that we serve. Great question.
Yeah, and I see we have a comment from Phyllis. Do you want to add about the model that you shared about how there are liaisons within the school systems that faculty can consult with, and maybe add a little bit more context?
Sure, I'd be glad to. We work with 3 or 4 school systems in our area, and I work in the and hi, Julie. And hi, Anita. So we work in the Center for Educational Networks and Impact. So we're actually, our center has the focus of both broader impacts and educational networks. And so we've worked with 3 school systems right now and are working on a couple others. So there's a person who has classroom experience in our office. And when someone comes to us and says, or someone says, I want to do a thing, they can first kind of bounce it off this person that's their job, before they take it to a teacher to say, and they often give a lot of feedback about, hey, that's never going to work for that grade level, or hey, that actually works for the next grade level up for standards of learning or whatever. But just having those relationships, and those folks are our boundary spanners. Anyway, it works really well. I recommend it.
So to be totally transparent, Phyllis is our point of connection. She's the one that I knew, and the one that Julie knew, and the one that said you need to talk to each other. So yeah, thank you, Phyllis.
Good. Yeah, no, I love this. I'm so excited to see it laying out, and I'm happy to. Anyway,
yeah,
it makes me very happy. We're spanning the boundaries.
We are. I'm so glad you're here.
Thanks for joining us. Glad you can add another layer to this conversation. And it's always great to see other advocates within academia who, much like the roles of librarians, right? If we don't know the answer, we at least know the right person to find. I think that's generally this audience here, but it's always great to see other people kind of making those connections as well, and seeing the value in the work that we all can do with each other. I did want to circle back to Amber's question. Along those same lines, how do you make meaningful contact with PK12 teachers when they are complete strangers? I feel like I'm cold calling them.
Can I jump in there, Julie?
Yeah.
So this is something that has come up since we've been working on where do we take this project next? What kinds of things are useful for people to know? And we've been working on a toolkit for the scholarly communication notebook that has a lot of different strategies, assignments, ways of teaching, a methodology, or at least a way of engagement. How would you start a project? What kinds of things do you need to know? How would you approach someone? And I think the conclusion I have come to through talking with Julie and thinking through the best ways of approaching an educator is to start with their administration and have them refer you. The school that you think you might want to do some work at might not be the place that the administrator has the highest level of need. They may say, this is not the correct level. We really need you over here. So finding out from someone who has a more, I guess has a higher level, rather than going to an individual teacher to say, how can I help you? Is I think a preferred method. Julie, do you want to jump in on that? That was eye-opening to me.
Yes, I think that's an important takeaway, is this idea that when you are cold calling teachers, essentially, and often it's done at random, and whoever answers your email is the one who gets the outreach, which is not really the most equitable way to ensure that your work is meeting or being in front of the people that need it the most. So that is one of the reasons why I recommend this idea of going to an administrator who can help you find a good fit for your outreach somewhere in the school district, because we know that first come, first serve can be inherently inequitable. Yeah, I think that's sort of my answer to that question.
All right, we have a couple comments here. Even getting a contact at the district level that then can recommend, a school administrator who they know has the need and capacity to work together. Yeah, sometimes you only need that one person who has an in, or has kind of what you mentioned, Anita, like a broader view of what's going on, can really be a key piece to that. Donna says, as a College of Education liaison, I meet and interact with graduate students who work in our local school districts and have made some entries through these teachers. Yeah, that's an interesting model too. Donna, do you want to add anything else to that?
Yeah, before COVID, I was teaching library instruction in a graduate class, and one of the teachers that was in that class is like, wow, my AP students in high school, about an hour away from where we were, well, maybe not quite an hour, can I bring them to the library and you can teach them what you just taught us here? So we started a relationship where 4 classes, AP classes from one high school, local high school, would come to the library. We would put them in the computer lab and do the same type of instruction. And then COVID hit. So she's like, so now what are we going to do? We can't come to the library. So I created an open Canvas. We use Canvas as our LMS course, using only open access resources, and shared that out. And she has been a real advocate in sharing that resource with other teachers and other people from other buildings and districts within that. So I think sometimes working from the ground up, as opposed to trying to come in at a level with your idea, is to talk to these people at the ground level and find out what's going on, and then figure out how to like work from there, as opposed to coming in from the administrative level, if that helps.
I would agree that there are a lot of different ways of approaching this. So I think these are that, and that's a fantastic compliment that they said, will you please come to my school and or teach my students too what you just taught me. That's a really great compliment.
I think that this idea of capitalizing on your existing networks of people, either your graduate students or your undergrads or anyone who has contact, is a great way to start your work and your outreach. One thing that I also encourage you to do when you're doing that is to work on extending the network. So rather than your graduate student works with a teacher and then you do outreach with that teacher, ask that teacher for a referral to someone who is not currently being served or someone they think that is in need of support. So that way you're always working on growing your network of outreach, and you're also making sure that you're trying to reach people who are underserved as well.
Thanks, Julie. I think the comment of maximizing your network highlights what Caitlin said here about knowing connections due to clinical, supervising teacher candidates, and other teaching university courses. So really trying to think outside of the box of who those partners might be or where those connections might lay. So great points all around. Make sure I haven't missed any other questions. It looks like there's another one, or maybe a comment rather. It seems like there are a lot of opportunities for open pedagogy, classes in education creating their own materials in undergrad and grad courses, and then sharing them with pre-K-12.
I think so, and I'm continuing to have conversations with a few different departments about just that, having primarily graduate students, some undergrads, but primarily graduate students creating materials and that are for the K-12 classroom. The questions are different, and the needs that we identified in terms of establishing a relationship are somewhat different than the actual things that those students need to learn. And for example, one of the groups said it would be really helpful if you could put together just a really quick guide on how to find openly licensed images. So figures, pictures, this is what people look, this is the #1 question that I get. Can I use this picture? And if not, how do I find one that with which I can replace it? So creating that kind of guide was never on our radar. We didn't think, okay, this is something that they won't know, or something that they want to have that they'd actually use. So I did create one. It's in draft, but I'm happy to share the link if that's helpful for you, if I can find it quickly. And then another comment relates to instructors in higher education and the pace at which they are teaching and how much, what chunks of information they need and when, and that it will generally be quite unique to their particular style of teaching, their sequence of their course and such. So I am working I have worked with one of Phyllis's colleagues and had a lot of conversations and realized, okay, what we're building in the ScholComm toolkit is not the same as what you need. So there's, yeah, we don't have it all figured out yet. At least I don't. Julie, do you have it all figured out?
I wish. That would be great. I would just make $1 million then. And yeah, I'd be on an island right now, maybe, who knows? Yeah, I think that that's a great point. I also think that it's really important to think about that there are some misconceptions I've sort of run into with working with K-12 is that a lot of times people in higher education will say, we really need a professor to do this outreach. And I would really encourage you to challenge that idea and think about it is maybe you really just need a graduate student to do that outreach. Or even if it's something like judging a third grade science fair, a nice undergrad is really competent enough to do that work. So thinking about how you can continue to grow your outreach capacity by extending into different groups with different skills or different skill levels, and how you can make sure that you're creating the best match so that your highly skilled people are not being overtaxed. You can make sure that you are distributing some of these lower skill events to people who have these lower skills, but who really want to do outreach, who are really excited about it, so that you can continue to grow your capacity.
Thank you. Just out of curiosity, how many folks here are connected to education, either in a library setting or as an educator? Are there folks kind of in the other areas beyond education? I'm seeing a lot of hand raises, so it looks like a good majority of us are within the education kind of side of things. I was curious, I know this presentation is mostly focused on education, but Julie and Anita, I know you've spent some time looking at other applications of boundary spanning and what that might look like in other areas. Can you kind of talk about that more generally, or how maybe some of these principles could work in other areas beyond education?
Yes. The idea of boundary spanning is very prominent in some business worlds. For example, in the technology coding world, there are people who are trying to be boundary spanners between the highly skilled level coders who are doing very technical work and their clients who have no technical knowledge, and trying to span the boundary of how can we make sure you're getting the project that you need. And communicate that to the person who is very skilled but may not be able to communicate with you in the best way. It's also a really popular in the healthcare world is this idea of boundary spanning, and how can we get the research that we're doing into the healthcare world in the speediest, most practical, cost-efficient way, and make sure, going the other way, that what is happening in the world of practice is informing the research that's being done in this area.
Great, thank you. All right, looks like Donna has another question. Was there a reason why you chose the concept boundary spanning as compared to the concept boundary crossing?
Yes. Some of them were practical in that boundary spanning is a little bit more prevalent in the literature. Another reason is that I prefer the sort of connotation that boundary spanning gives, and that I think boundary spanning gives the idea that there are these separate groups and we're building a bridge. We're building a permanent fixture sort of to span this gap. It's not, we're not crossing one time. We're not just going over there and sharing knowledge. I like the idea of we're creating a permanent highway, pathway, bridge between these groups. So for me, that was really the motivation behind it.
So Julie is the one who introduced me to this body of literature. I did not come with a lot of prior knowledge. I had heard the terminology before and had read a little bit about it, but it wasn't something that it wasn't something that was central to the I wasn't as familiar with the literature as as Julie is. So I think it's a good fit for what we have done, because we have between Julie and I, kind of tried to straddle divides of understanding, and then facilitate others who are in that sort of role. So there's learning on both sides, and I think it's a really nice. Yeah, I think the theory is really nice too, and that it fits for the scenario that we're working with, as well as how we are working with each other, because we have both learned quite a lot about what, yeah, we both learned quite a lot.
There are also a few other prominent terms. For example, I would say knowledge broker is another prominent term for people who are sort of doing this work. I don't like that term as much, in that it kind of gives the impression that we are this person who is protecting our resource or charging for something that we're doing. But I prefer the idea of the boundary spanning, that we're creating this open connection. But that's really just my personal preference.
And I see, Monica, you've shifted roles a little bit from a 6 through 12 grade librarian into a new role in an academic setting. So hopefully, one, you have a lot of kind of prior experience in your role as a school librarian and know how to kind of be a boundary spanner in that way. And maybe that will leverage and work and pair nicely in your new role. How exciting. It's always a little bit scary shifting gears, but having some of that previous experience can certainly be helpful. Dana, I see your hands up. I'm not sure if that's related to the education, or do you have a question? I saw your hand went down. All right. I don't think we have any other questions. Is there anything else folks want to talk about, or do have questions for Anita and Julie? Oh. Sure, go ahead. You can unmute yourself or pop it in the chat, whatever's easier.
Okay, I'll just do this real quick. Hi. So one of the things we have going on and have had for years is that the liaison to the School of Education, which is now me, works with local AP and IB programs, usually brings the students to campus. So the original idea behind that was, we can give you so much more expanded access to content and to resources. But because of how contracts are written, of course, you have to be on campus to do those things. And what I'm running into is, as everything moves more and more on campus and everybody assumes that everybody has their own devices, we're having a hard time. I'm having a hard time keeping access points in this building that I'm currently standing in for all the kids who don't go to school at my university. And so what I was curious about is anyone else running into this problem? And if so, how are they addressing it? How are they, because I'm having both you can't get rid of all the desktops. The students can't get to the desktops unless, of course, you want to give me a whole bunch of laptops I can just store until they're here and have them automatically log in. So I was just curious if anybody else had run into anything like that at all and how they were handling it. Thank you.
I think the idea of access to technology, especially, is one of the things that we talk about, how COVID really brought that to light, and that there are these huge divides and gaps in who has the resources and technology and who does not. I sometimes find that can be a useful tool in framing the conversation to talk about, and that when we take away these resources, we are increasing inequities in our system, either in our school or in the people who are using our resources. And that's just true, that not everyone has access to Wi-Fi or a computer, and that when we take away the publicly owned machines that people can access, that we are automatically increasing the inequities. That's usually how I talk about it, and find that useful for framing when talking to people about why we should not remove these machines or why there should be funding for these machines. I think that a lot of things have, Anita can talk about this more. I think a lot of things have changed about libraries, especially in recent years, but especially also since I was a kid and they were books and there was a row of computers, and now there's not a ton of books in libraries. So I think that how we envision how this shared public space changes, how it can still meet the needs of our users, is something that is really important. If possible, it might be interesting if you could do some sort of data collection evaluation survey about the needs, that you could present data saying that there are these needs and wants. We have all these people who would use them and we're not doing it. That might be convincing.
Thank you. Yeah, just to answer some of the questions. So we do have, so I'm in Alabama, we have the AVL. It's not as awesome as, say, Galileo in Georgia, but it's good. But what they have access to is very limited. You know, they don't have JSTOR. They don't have, you know, all these anthropology kids are showing up and they're wanting to be archaeologists, and they have all of these year-long projects, and it's just limited. So I do have one school, Amber, that I've been teaching the AVL to exclusively because I've had to start teaching them online. If I can get them into the building, I can teach them and show them all the other stuff. And I like the idea that Belinda had, or what you guys do, which each school gets a username. So we can track, but we do it student by student. So everybody who comes to the session gets a temporary card so they can check out books, and they also get temporary IDs when they come into use. So I'm just looking for possible ways to either change what we're doing or solutions on how to just, you know, hold on to what we've got. You know, that double whammy of everything's online, but yeah, but no. Thank you.
So what I'm seeing are really two different problems. One is that the equipment, there is less and less equipment. Some of you said your library has taken out computers for social distancing purposes, and remodeling the building means that you're losing even more. Others maybe have computer labs, but how do you get into, you know, you have to be on site to use them. Can you teach remotely? I'm wondering if there are some public library solutions here too, if there are ways to use those kind of databases, or again, what Amber says, using free databases from your state, perhaps. We have two different solutions in the university libraries at Virginia Tech. One is a lending technology lending desk that lends everything from cameras, laptops. I think it probably lends things like keyboards and like music, piano keyboards and sewing machines and things, just a really wide range of technologies. The other resource that we have is a cart, a locked cart that has laptops in it. And I know these are really expensive, which is why they're locked, but those can move from one classroom to another. Some classrooms have their own. I think we have two of them. but that's an option. So a student, one of our students or a visiting student group, if someone forgets their computer or it's not working, there's a backup. So those tend to have, I think, around 20 computers per cart. So those are a few options. I know those are not inexpensive, and that's not every institution that can acquire those kinds of things, but we do have maybe 4 public machines in the whole library right now. So yeah, if you're from the public and you don't have access to one of the classrooms and you don't have your own phone or your own laptop, it's really tricky. So this is a really good question, Dina.
All right, we have a few more minutes before we wrap up today. I did pop in the feedback survey, so if you wouldn't mind taking a few seconds to fill that out, I would greatly appreciate it. Yes, and then we have some additional feedback. Some librarian classrooms have carts of laptops. I know we at Indiana University are shifting towards more of a fluid model where we have those available, and it can be helpful, but then yeah, scheduling becomes another consideration when you have a set use of technology that everyone's kind of vying for. Yeah, yeah, making sure they're plugged in and that you have all the software that you need. I know we've run into that issue when we've done workshops and admin has locked the capacity to download things, and yeah, so always making sure you have what you need before running a workshop can be helpful. Any other final questions for Julie and Anita before we wrap up today? Or comments, questions, comments?
Thanks everyone for talking with us today and watching our presentation and having the discussion with us. It was really great meeting you all and talking with you all, and I really enjoyed our discussion.
Likewise, thank you so much for your time and for your interest in this kind of topic. It'll be fun to see what kinds of things you get to do in the future. Thank you for the invitation as well to the committee. So it's nice.
Thank you both for sharing your information again and kind of expanding on where your project has kind of gone from your initial presentation, and any of the insights and kind of practical pieces have been really beneficial for me, and it sounds like it has been for other folks too. So thank you again for your time, and thank you everyone, and Gina from ACRL for helping us coordinate this event. Like I said, keep your eye out for additional events hosted by EBSS and ACRL in the future, and take care. Have a great day.